Y'all, it's your boy Fight Critic here to give you guys another video. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell notification so that you get notified whenever I drop any new content. Feel free to drop any comments on any topics that you'd like for me to cover, and at the same time, leave me any YouTube links for any content you wish for me to have any sort of reaction or any sort of response to. So we are at the moment in time that we expected to be at. Well, at least I could say that when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, DAZN, and Golden Boy Promotions. This dropped last night, roughly a little bit after 12 o'clock. It was reported by Dan Rafael that Canelo Alvarez is suing DAZN, Golden Boy, and De La Hoya for a breach of contract. I will put the link to this article in the description so that this way you can read about it. But for the most part, 2 years ago, Canelo Alvarez signed a 10-fight, $365 million deal that essentially made him the highest paid boxer in the history of the sport, contractually wise. And it also made huge waves in terms of DAZN being as aggressively as they could after locking up, using Matchroom for their American promoter, and at the same time securing a $1 billion budget in order to finance fights. And of course, they made it known to us that this sort of side deal would also be able to compensate for signing arguably the biggest boxer in the sport. And not just the biggest boxer in the sport, but the guy who's generating the most revenue in the sport right now as well. And that is Canelo Alvarez. But what we've seen within the last year is Canelo Alvarez be upset with not only DAZN, but also his own promoter. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Canelo Alvarez was under the impression that he would sign this deal and he would have control over who he would get to fight at any point in time. And what we've seen is people on both sides of the fence, being Canelo and Golden Boy, and even the third side, DAZN, have differences in what they expected this deal to look like. So when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, he feels that the opponents that he has fought has classified under the terms that DAZN would be quote unquote dubbed a premium opponent, whereas De La Hoya and Golden Boy Promotions essentially used Canelo to get DAZN to sign him to a deal so that they would have budget so that they can finance Golden Boy fights. And DAZN was under the impression that Canelo signing would also mean that Canelo would also be seeking to fight top-level opponents on a consistent basis. Now, let's just give everybody like a quick reality check. For Canelo Alvarez, you knew that deal looked too good to be true. Even when you look at some of the biggest fight deals in terms of who's fighting who, the only real fight deal that you can compare this to is the Floyd Mayweather 6-fight deal with Showtime that he signed back in, I believe it was 2012. Yeah. When Floyd signed for Showtime and he had his 6-fight opponents, a lot of people were under the impression that we weren't going to get high-level fights. But what came out of those fights were two really good fights with Marcos Maidana and the Manny Pacquiao fight. And for a lot of people, many people didn't really care much for the Robert Guerrero fight, but a lot of people did tune in to watch it. And of course, not many people cared much for the Andre Berto fight. But for Floyd, he was on essentially a multiple fight tear, which also included Canelo Alvarez. He had fought Canelo, 2 Marcos Maidana fights, and Manny Pacquiao 4 straight times. And those 4 fights made a lot of sense in terms of who the opponent was and the amount of revenue it generated. Canelo Alvarez, being one of those opponents, was easily, one of the marquee fights of that era when we talk about the early 2010s. And granted, he lost, but at the same time, it was a really good fight. And when it comes to the Manny Pacquiao fight, I mean, that fight was long overdue. So for Canelo, when he got this big, huge, massive, contract, he had already had his biggest fights already. He had already fought Gennady Golovkin twice, and the network was expecting for him to fight Gennady Golovkin a 3rd time, which, personally, I don't need to see a 3rd fight. I thought the 2nd fight answered all the questions that needed to be asked, but there's still a lot of people who still believe that Canelo, either didn't win the fight convincing enough for them, or they felt that it was due to judging that Gennady Golovkin should really be 1-1 versus Canelo, as opposed to being 0-1-1. So because of that, many people thought the idea was to push for DAZN to try to stage a third Gennady Golovkin fight. HBO is out of the picture because HBO dissolved their boxing broadcasting team and their network for that section of the sport. So it just seemed like really ideal. And on the flip side, you also had Eddie Hearn, who was trying to sign up as many middleweight prospects as possible and ended up only managing to get Demetrius Andrade before eventually getting, Billy Joe Saunders. But Billy Joe Saunders can't even make middleweight at this point. But for many people, that was, the consensus was Canelo signing with DAZN would allow them to create more unification fights, but they didn't really lead that way. The Danny Jacobs fight was a good fight. It was the fight that you needed to, introduce Canelo to, especially after the Rocky Fielding situation. Yeah, the Canelo Jacobs fight was the fight that you needed for it. And then, of course, you had Canelo versus Sergey Kovalev, which on the pure level of what the actual sport looks like, that fight looks good. But on the flip side, Sergey Kovalev probably wasn't the type of opponent that many people would want to have Canelo fight in comparison to the other light heavyweights that were around at that time. For DAZN really is at fault here. They're at fault for a couple of reasons. One of the biggest reasons why they're at fault is you signed this guy to a massive contract, and you didn't put stipulations into it. I guess, I don't know if it's because they were expecting him to be, very reciprocal and, get fights for here and there. But at the same time, you signed the biggest guy in the sport to your network, or to your platform, I should say, but you didn't put any stipulations as far as who should he fight. And that's the biggest thing about it. Because you haven't done that, you are definitely at fault here, because you're not saying, hey, Canelo, before you sign this, we just want to let you know that we have a list of guys that we want you to fight, in terms of guys who are currently champions, guys who are up-and-coming champions, and then, of course, we want to leave you some leeway in case some new guys kind of pop up, and we'd want you to consider them as well. And because you lock them into so many fights, it's hard to scale and project what the sport is going to look like across 11 fights. A lot of guys can spend 11 years fighting 11 fights. But for many people, it's kind of weird that they would offer this type of contract without it. And what also has them as fault is just because of the fact that regardless of where you are in terms of your business model and doing this and doing that, you had the expectation that signing Canelo Alvarez was also going to mean that a lot of boxers would end up also signing to your platform to fight Canelo. And that isn't what was happening. In fact, Danny Jacobs used Canelo as a way for him to secure, a huge contract, because he looked at it in the sense of, well, Canelo's now at the network. He's going to need somebody to fight at middleweight. I have a title. I have fought a really good fight against Gennady Golovkin, in which I didn't get, my hand raised at the end of the night. But I am a very good, viable opponent for Canelo Alvarez. And for many people, especially Eddie Hearn, he had to deliver. So in those situations, you will have to overpay for a guy like Danny Jacobs. So if that was going to be the situation, you also look at Gennady Golovkin. He was seen as the most viable option for Canelo to fight in terms of the public view. And he was able to use the fact that they would need him in order to make a third fight, and he signed a massive contract. So when those things happen, DAZN probably felt really good about their placing and was like, cool, we can definitely try to get these fights going. But then came the issue of, well, we originally had a budget, and now we've had to hand out so many of these contracts that we don't know where a lot of this money is going to come from in order to compensate for it. And that's not Canelo's fault. He didn't tell you to go and sign Danny Jacobs to a massive 7-figure contract, that would also exceed up to 8 figures. at the end of it. He didn't tell you to sign Gennady Golovkin to a 9-figure contract, you know? Because you went out of the way and did that, that's not his fault. It's Canelo's job to step in the ring, deliver, have the opponents, and then after that, you just reap all the benefits. He's still the only guy that can generate the amount of subscribers to your network. Still to this day, you guys have been around for about 2 years, you know? So for many people, there's so much that DAZN kind of left out that they needed to. And this is where Oscar De La Hoya and Golden Boy Promotions come in. Because it's already been proven that Oscar De La Hoya lied to not only DAZN, but he also lied to Golden Boy. Not to Golden Boy, he also lied to Canelo Alvarez. He helped negotiate and structure this deal based on a lot of hearsay. That he was going to convince Canelo to fight Gennady Golovkin a 3rd time. That he was going to convince Canelo Alvarez to fight all these fucking MMA stars and YouTube stars to generate attention so that he could get a budget and use that budget in order to put his cards on. So Golden Boy and Oscar De La Hoya are at fault here as well because they lied in order to secure this deal. And I'm not surprised that they lied about it, you know? Oscar De La Hoya has lied on a grand jury before, you know? So the idea that he would lie to a company in order to get what he wants, I'm not shocked. I'm not surprised by that. So I'm not surprised that Canelo was also suing not only his promoter, but also the DAZN streaming platform. And he's suing him for $280 million, which means that within the 3 fights that Canelo has received, that total amount of money is definitely not left over, but I think he's also suing for that total amount as well based on the fact of what comes in handy with Golden Boy and the fact that they were able to secure a budget off him and lie to him, which is the big thing. So I think that's why you're seeing that number figure be so high. And just to give you some perspective on lawsuits, when Golden Boy sued Al Heyman for quote-unquote stealing their fighters and breaking Sherman antitrust laws, they sued Heyman for quote-unquote stealing up to 100 fighters off of them for $300 million. Canelo Alvarez is one fighter who is suing 3 different entities for a total of $280 million. And while I don't feel that that figure will end up passing in court in terms of what they have to give Canelo, what I think what will end up happening is a judge is going to have to let DAZN know that they are going to have to work with Canelo Alvarez to approve of his fights and figure this thing out. Because if not, then you're either going to have to let him out of his contract and pay him, pay him a specific amount of money to break that contract. And I'm pretty sure that there's clauses in his contract that guarantee him a specific amount of money should the network cancel it. But at the same time, it's definitely like a huge issue right now with DAZN. DAZN's struggling. Where's Denzel when he played Malcolm X? That brother's starving, huh? But yeah, DAZN is struggling right now. They're struggling to have subscribers in the U.S. They keep talking about them obtaining licenses for different types of things outside of the U.S. And I keep telling people all the time that it doesn't matter how many licenses they have outside the U.S. If anything, if they want to take those licenses, take whatever money they make outside the U.S. and try to pump it into this thing, they're going to find themselves in even more financial trouble. The big problem that they have is they threw so much money into a niche sport without thinking about the fact that their platform doesn't have enough in order to generate revenue. And for many people, I think we would have all just been okay had it just been, something that Eddie Hearn was doing and Golden Boy was doing. And, they latched on, they got another promoter and they gave them budgets. But when you start handing out these massive deals to specific boxers, it becomes a huge issue because those boxers are going to want to get paid for everything. And, a lot of people took a big shit on Deontay Wilder for turning down DAZN's offer. But like with most people, when you kind of look at things in hindsight, he'd probably be in the same position right now. And I honestly wouldn't be shocked if Gennady Golovkin follows steps and also ends up suing DAZN in the near future. Especially if he runs into the same path as if Canelo's gone, he's going to be the guy that has to carry the network for them. And if he has to carry the network for them, they're going to have to approve of his fights. The big reason why I'm not mentioning somebody like Anthony Joshua is because Anthony Joshua does not have a contract that ties him to DAZN. His promoter does. But if Anthony Joshua were to fight, another person that's considered to be on the same revenue generating level as him, it doesn't have to be on DAZN. They can be another person that bids on different types of deals in order to get those fights. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I think a lot of people are, they're not informed on what these kind of contracts look like, and they're also not informed of how, the promoters have set everything up. I don't want Canelo Alvarez to end up in going through like a Mikey Garcia situation, where he's just, because of approval of opponents, he's got to sit on the sideline. He's 30 years old. He's not getting any younger, and the longer he stays out, and the longer that he's not conditioning himself to meet a specific weight class, he's not going to be roughly worth that contract after all. So hopefully they can come to a decision, or let Canelo out, let him go shop, or let him do one fight deals, which is what a lot of big name fighters tend to do. But I'll be following this one closely. If I find a link to all the court documents, I'll drop it in the description. And looking forward to coming back with you guys with another video. I'm out of here.